Hi everyone, I'm sorry I can't join you this week for your British Free Range Egg Producers Association meeting. So I hope the technology works and that you're able to see and hear me. I also apologize for the aura behind me. It's an unusually sunny day here in Ayrshire. But I'm going to talk you through the study that we collaborated on together about enrichments for free range hens. And while I'm giving the presentation, I want to acknowledge Lawrence Baker and Joe Dombevand, who are the people that collected the data, and Sarah Brocklehurst, who's a statistician that I work closely with, who did the data analysis and helped me write the report, scientific paper, and so on. Laying hens are highly motivated to show foraging behavior. So that's the food seeking aspect of eating, all the things that lead up to eating behavior itself. And even though they're given food in a food trough, which is perfectly suitable for their needs and they don't have to show food seeking behavior, they still are motivated to show this behavior. And if foraging behavior is thwarted or stopped, then the birds can go on to develop injurious pecking. So that includes the severe feather pecking that causes feather damage, cannibalism, vent pecking, and so on. And so not only are those things bad for bird welfare, but it's not good for egg production either. And in the barn and free range housing systems, hens are very often now given destructible enrichments to encourage appropriate pecking behavior. But what Profrepra were interested to know was, are those types of enrichments actually beneficial? Are they doing what you're hoping they're doing, i.e. reducing feather damage and encouraging appropriate behaviors? And when Robert and James and I were talking about this initially, I think it was Robert said to me that a lot of the producers are putting in alfalfa hay bales, and that seemed to be the real trendy thing to be adding, but was it actually useful? So the study aims, which we're going to be addressing here, are to observe behavior and feather cover of commercially housed hens when they're given access to 4 different enrichments. And we wanted to use enrichments that were commonly being used by producers that you work with, and to look at if there were any preference for the hens, and we would assess preference by looking at appropriate behaviors like foraging behavior in and around those enrichments. We would investigate whether the enrichments actually affect feather cover, but also to have a look at what the costs of installing these enrichments were. I better warn you now that my floating head is going to get shifted around throughout the presentation depending on which bit of the slide I need you to see. But in terms of how we set up the study, we were fortunate enough to get 8 commercial flocks recruited through the Ranger magazine. Every farm that we got involved contributed 2 flocks, so that was great. And all the farms were in Scotland, so we had 4 farms which each had 2 flocks. For consistency, we recruited from farms that could offer us sheds that were only using brown strain hens, which I realize is quite common anyway, but that they were 16,000 bird flocks and that they were all using multi-tier structures, because we wanted to limit the variation that might interfere with the things that we were really focusing on. And just by luck, really, we were fortunate that of all the sheds and farm flocks that we recruited, the multi-tier structures were all the same. Everybody was using the Natura step system by Big Dutchman, and they were all like the picture you see in the top left-hand image here, that they had the floor and then the 2 levels of the multi-tier system. So that was a nice bit of consistency. And of course, because the sheds were the size that they were, the sheds were split into 4 quarters of 4,000 hens per quarter, which we took into account in the study design, as you're going to see in a minute. And in all of the flocks, they were all RSPCA accredited, so we stuck to the requirement of providing 2 enrichments per 1,000 hens. And the pictures that you see here in this image are the enrichments that we used. So in the top left, you'll see on the floor is a bale of alfalfa or lucerne hay. It's sitting on the floor at the moment, but you can just about see hanging off the ramp that there's a hay net, and this was put into the hay net a day or so later. And so we would install the hay bales in the hay nets typically. The other thing that we used were pecking blocks produced by Crystallix, which is a German company. And we put them on plastic lids or bits of slatted floor like you see here to keep them off the litter and stop them from going damp. The other enrichment that we provided as kind of a standard control enrichment were lengths of rope. And that's what you see in the bottom left-hand picture here. These are 30-centimeter lengths of jute rope, so it's a fairly natural fiber that we would loop over the alighting rail at the bottom of the multi-tier section and attach them with cable ties. And then the final enrichment that we used was to scatter pelleted feed. This is a standard layer pellet from for farmers, and we provided plastic tubs to keep the feed in that could be kept in the shed in the quarter that this treatment was being used in to keep out rodents and stop the birds getting at it. And we provided them with a jug that was marked off to hold 2 kilos at a time, and this feed would be scattered into the litter twice a day. So those are the enrichments that we used, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about how we set it up to make sure it was all balanced next. To explain a little bit further about how we set up the enrichments in the different sheds, so bear in mind that we had 4 different enrichment types. We always presented those in conjunction with rope so that we were meeting the RSPCA accreditation requirements for the farms, but also so that we could have a direct comparison between an enrichment and ropes as a kind of control. So of the 4 quarters that was in every shed, each quarter at each flock had this kind of presentation once. So ropes only in one quarter, lucerne, hay bales and ropes in another quarter, and so on. And so in the ropes only quarter, we had 8 ropes, 4 which were classed as enrichment and 4 that were classed as control rope. So that is a consistent way that we did it across every quarter. So in a quarter, for example, that had the lucerne hay bales, there would be 4 ropes, which were classed as control rope, and then there'd be 4 hay bales. The pecking blocks, we had to provide those as pecking block pairs, because the pecking blocks were recommended to be provided at 1 block per 500 hens. So we paired them up to make enough for 1,000 hens, so 4 pairs and 4 ropes. And the scattered pelleted feed was a bit unusual in that it had to be put down daily. We asked staff to provide it twice a day. They split 4 kilos of feed over 2 scatterings, but the total amount, 4 kilos of feed, meant that on average there was 1 gram of feed per hen per day. And I'll show you in a minute where we scattered it and where these things were placed and positioned. So what we did was we installed all these enrichments in the different quarters, and I should say that different flocks had the position of the enrichments was varied across the flock so that we were balanced, so that the scattered pellet feed wasn't always near the annex, for example. I should also say that the scattered pelleted feed was provided to the staff we provided plastic barrels to keep the feed in, and they kept it actually in the quarter that was being used for this treatment. And we provided the jug that you saw in the previous picture, an old milk jug that we had marked off so it was clear how much they had to fill it up to make it as easy as possible for them to use. So what we did once all the enrichments had been installed around the time that pullets arrived is we then went back at 3 different ages and we observed behavior. And so what we would do is we would always start at the pelleted feed treatment quarter, and that's because that enrichment was being provided in 2 distinct times per day, and we wanted to capture the worst case scenario, if you like. So when the enrichment had been not provided for a long time to see what behavior was like then, we then wanted to look around what was happening at feed scatter when probably it was going to be of most interest, and then we observed again about an hour after feed scatter. And what we did was, we would always start in the scattered pellet feed treatment, the PF treatment, and we would make observations, and then we would move to the next quarter, make observations until we had made all our way around. And we spent 15 minutes in each quarter, so that after an hour we were back at the pelleted feed treatment, and we would start again. What we did during those observations is we would count the number of birds in 1 meter diameter locations and what behavior the birds were involved in. And you're going to see in the next set of slides what those locations were. In every 15-minute block, when we were observing the birds, we took 3 observations, so about every 5 minutes, and then we would move to the next quarter. But before we moved away, after observing behavior, we would also record the feather scores of 10 birds at the location which we called away, and you'll see that in a minute. And we would do that remotely. So we do that without handling the birds, which stops a lot of disturbance in the flock. It does mean that sometimes you can't see both sides of the birds, because if they happen to be standing facing away from you, you might see the left side, not the right side. But we still find it's a good indicator of feather damage in the flock. And the method of feather assessment is seen here in this bottom table. We assessed the birds at 5 different areas: the tails, the wings, the back, the neck, and the breast. And the birds all those areas of the body get classified according to the scoring system you see here. Now, the scoring system actually goes from 0 to 5. 4 and 5 are particularly bad feather pecking, lots of bare skin, wounds, and so on. But we never saw scores above 2, so I've only shown you how we classify scores 0, 1, and 2 here. And so, to give you an idea of how our observations took place, this is an overhead sketch. I'm not much of an artist, as you can see, of any one quarter in the shed. So this gray area would be the multi-tier system, and the yellow area would be the litter area. So, for example, in the case of where we put bales or pecking blocks in the shed quarter, then it would look a little bit like this. On the alighting rail to the multi-tier system, we would tie at regular intervals, well spaced out, these pieces of rope. And the observation that we would do around one of those pieces of rope, a 1 meter diameter area, that would be considered the control R observation area. And then we would do another observation around the enrichment. And, excuse me, that's my dog walking past. That would be a 1 meter area around the enrichment, so around the hay bale or around the pecking blocks. And of course, if the bales are hung up, which they would have been by this time, then again, it's just the circle underneath the bale and including the bale. And then there's plenty of litter area that doesn't have either of these enrichments in, and so a 1 meter area away from either of those enrichments was classed as away. And that's also the area in which the observations took place, but also the feather scores were done in the away diameter. And then for the quarters that just had rope, they had 8 pieces of rope, and they were just randomly assigned one of the observation areas as control rope and the other one as enrichment. And there would also be an away observation and feather score area. And then when it came to the quarter that had the scattered feed, when we set up in the sheds with the enrichments around the time of pullet arrival, we would sometimes mark on the wall or agree with the farm staff between certain potholes that the feed should be scattered on the litter about the width of a man's shoulders to scatter the feed down in the litter. So we still had these distinct areas where feed wasn't being scattered, and again we had a diameter around one of the ropes, so that was the control R observation area. We then had an area around the scattered feed, which was considered the enrichment, and then again a diameter away from anything, which was known as away. Now, due to avian influenza, but also COVID, some visits to some flocks were missed at 52 and 70 weeks. And so, for example, at 52 weeks, we weren't able to go and visit flocks G and H, and we didn't get behavior or feather scores from that flock. But we were a little more prepared before the 70-week observations. And so for some flocks that affected, which was C, D, E, and F, we couldn't go into the sheds and collect behavior data. We couldn't expect farm staff to do what we had been doing, but we did ask farm staff to take photographs of birds in the different areas around the shed. So in the different quarters away from the enrichments. And we tried to use those photographs to produce some feather score information. But we found that the feather score data from photos was unreliable. It didn't follow the trends we had seen in the live observations. And so we excluded the feather score data taken from photographs from the analysis. So that means particularly at 70 weeks, we're missing quite a bit of data, and we only have 4 flocks to give us data here and 6 flocks to give us data here. We then processed the data and we analyzed it in a statistical package called GenStat. It's version 18. And in the analysis, we looked at both the total counts of birds in each of those 3 locations that I've mentioned, but we also looked at the proportions of birds observed in those locations engaged in each behavior. And we used statistical analyses called generalized linear mixed models and linear mixed models. And when you're going to be looking at the graphs shortly, the y-axis is going to look a bit strange. It doesn't look like counts of birds or percentages, and that's because the data often has to be transformed to be analyzable. So for example, we might multiply everything by a log scale to make it, to enable us to use these statistical models to test it. And of course, before we undertook any of the work, it was approved by the ethical committee to allow us to perform the study. So if I now talk you through some of the results, this first table that I wanted to show you is just to give you an overall picture of the numbers of birds that we saw around the enrichments, the control rope, and in the away area. And so these are mean values and standard deviation of the total counts of birds, regardless of what behavior they're involved in, just according to the location and treatment. So the striking thing, I think, that you'll see from this is that birds, regardless of what treatment they were in, the numbers of birds around the control ropes was around 7 birds. And it was very similar in the away area. It was about sort of 7 to 9 birds in the away area. But if you look at the enrichments, as long as it wasn't the rope enrichment, then the numbers of birds just kind of hanging out in that 1 meter diameter area, regardless of what they're doing, is considerably higher. You have between 11 and 17 birds in that 1 meter diameter circle. Now, the ropes, whether they're classed as enrich or control rope, is all the same as you would expect. It's about 7 birds. So it's considerably less attractive to hang out by ropes than it is to be in the vicinity of the other enrichments that we were providing. I should point out that these figures that are in brackets, that is an estimation from the statistical modeling. This is just the raw value from the data we collected, but we've included this here because this is relevant to data analysis. We were interested to know what proportions of birds were actually interacting with the enrichment in some way. So pecking at it, standing on it, getting involved with it in some form or another. So this graph is trying to answer the question that of the birds that we observed around the enrichment, so that's either the what we classed as the enrichment diameter or the control rope area, what proportion of birds are actually interacting with the enrichments, and do those differ significantly? And so I'll talk you through this graph on the right hand side. The most of the figures at the bottom, these are all solid colored lines. Those are all the control R areas. The only one that's not a solid line here is this black dashed line, and that's the rope that was classed as enrich. So essentially what this is saying is all the places where there were ropes, so the control R areas or the enrichment where it was rope, had low proportions of birds interacting with the enrichments in comparison to the pelleted feed, which is this one that peaks in the middle, or the peck blocks or the bales. So pelleted feed, bales, and peck blocks get a higher proportion of birds, a significantly higher proportion of birds interacting with them than any version of the ropes. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when it comes to the pelleted feed, this red dashed line, you get a peak when the feed is scattered. And that's understandable because around outside of those times, the pelleted feed probably depletes from the litter as the birds pick it up. And so their interest in the interacting with the area where the feed is scattered diminishes in the hour after scattering and just before scattering, but it peaks at the time the feed is scattered. But the take-home message here really is just that those three enrichments show significantly greater interest from the birds in terms of interacting with the enrichment than do the ropes. This graph is looking at the proportions of birds that show foraging behavior according to the treatment. And just to talk you through the graph a little bit, the y-axis has got these funny negative numbers. That's because it's a transformation of proportions on a logit scale, so they look a bit odd, but it doesn't take away from the picture, if you like. And we looked at the proportion of birds foraging in the litter in the three different locations. So in that 1 meter diameter around the control ropes, around the enrichment, and in the away diameter as well. Excuse me. And the color code is the same. The black line is the ropes treatment, the blue is the bales, green is the peck blocks, and red is the pelleted feed. And I apologize if anyone's colorblind, but this one that shows the deep V, which is red, is the pelleted feed one. The first thing I want you to note is that regardless of the location in the shed that the observation took place, foraging is about the same. So there isn't an increase in foraging around the enrichment. Birds forage in a similar way in all three of the areas. The only place that it really differs is with the pelleted feed. Now, that might not seem intuitive because you would have thought that when we scatter feed, you would get a lot of foraging there. That's true, but when the birds forage at the pelleted feed, that's classed as interacting with the enrichment because that is what we were interested in. This is about foraging in the areas around the enrichment, not actually interacting with the enrichment itself. So you do see this steep decline in foraging in the enriched location with the pelleted feed as the birds stop perhaps foraging a little bit in the general vicinity and go to interact with the scattered feed. So that's where you get a drop in that behavior. But apart from that, there are no differences in terms of changing foraging behavior in birds with these enrichments. When it came to feather scores, at all ages, feather scores were low, so that means that they were good. They did get worse with age, as you would expect. So if you look at this table on the right-hand side, this is the mean feather score value plus or minus the standard deviation for birds by age, but also by location. And then at the very bottom, you've got the total feather score value, which is basically when you add these 5 scores up. And so you can see that at 34 and 52 weeks, feather damage is low, which is great. And it's gone up a bit by 70 weeks with an average of about 2. But still, feather score is generally good, even at age 70 weeks. So what we're really interested to know is, do the enrichments make any difference to feather scores? And we use feather scores as a proxy way of estimating feather pecking and injurious pecking damage. And we saw that total mean feather scores were significantly affected by a combination of age and treatment. So if you look at this graph here on the right-hand side, you can see at 34 weeks of age, there's no difference. All 4 of those treatments are all clumped together, and you can't distinguish between them. But as the birds get older, you start to see a spread in the feather scores. Now, at 52 weeks, bear in mind that we no longer have data from 8 flocks like we do here. We're down to 6 flocks. And what we see here is that you have a lower feather score with the blue line. That's the bale hens, compared to things like the rope and the pelleted feed. And that might not be surprising in terms of an outcome. But what is surprising, and what gives us cause for concern that perhaps this data overall isn't reliable, is that by 70 weeks, the picture has shifted. And you wouldn't really expect that. You would expect the trends you see at 52 weeks to continue to 70 weeks, but maybe they would spread out a bit more. But instead, what we see is a swap between pelleted feed and hay bales, lucerne hay bales, in that now the hay bales have the worst feather score and the pelleted feed has the best. So we're not entirely sure how to interpret that, but again, this is based on very small numbers of flocks because we've lost data due to COVID and AI, but also that even though statistically the tests say these are different from one another, we should bear in mind that the differences are really small. So you quite possibly wouldn't notice any difference if you walked through the shed and looked at these different quarters across these various flocks. So statistics might pick it up, but it might not be terribly relevant because, as I said, the differences are small. Something else that I should mention here is, as you all know, the quarters inside the shed is split up into quarters inside the shed, but of course the range is not. Nobody puts fences up to keep hens in each quarter sticking to their quarter. So there is a potential risk that hens come out of pop holes in one quarter and walk up the shed wall and go in another quarter. But I don't really think that would have a major influence on the scores here, because not all 4,000 birds are going out and mixing on the range and going back to different shed areas. Small proportions of the birds tend to go out onto range, and you never end up with like 6,000 hens in one quarter and only 2,000 in another. So we think that's probably would only have a very small influence. And we were mindful of that when we started, but we did it on the assumption that that would be the case. There would be a little bit of mixing, but it wouldn't be significant. In this final set of results, I wanted to talk about the costs of providing these enrichments, because regardless of any benefits we might see from providing enrichments, some might be prohibitive because of their cost. So the first thing I wanted to point out to you was that replacement rates really varied from the flock to flock of the 8 that we studied. So this is an example of the replacement rate of the lucerne hay bales. It doesn't matter which flock is A and which is G and which is H and so on in this picture, but really the point is just to say that over the course of the full period of study, it's shown here in days, that it really varied how frequently people replaced the bales. And the pictures for the other enrichments are similar. The only one that was consistent was the provision of pelleted feed, because we had specified to staff that you should do that twice a day at 2 kilos per day. So that didn't vary, but the other ones did. And that's because if I look at the column on the bales as an example, we had always provided the staff with a recommended rate of replacement, but we had also said never have the birds without the enrichment. And so if you have to replace sooner, then do so. And we stayed in touch with the farms, because if they needed more bales or peck blocks or whatever, we made sure that we had them supplied accordingly. And as an example, I'll talk you through these each to tell you how we came up with the costs. But as an example, Doug Wanstall, who provided the hay bales free of charge, which is fantastic of him, he had advised us that the replacement rate was about 21 days if you provided bales at this kind of rate for hens. What we actually saw was, on average, the replacement rate was every 22 days, so that wasn't far off. But of course, as you can see from this picture in the top right, it did vary from flock to flock, and some replaced them much sooner, and some didn't have to replace them that quick at all. And that's why the standard deviation is fairly high. It's a standard deviation of 9 days. Per bale, this doesn't include transport costs, but the cost was about £6.50 per bale. So to go through a shed of 16,000 birds and provide one bale at a rate of 1 bale per 1,000 hens, you obviously need 16 bales to get started. So that would be £104 just to get hay bales down on the ground or in your hay nets to get the bird started. And then about every 22 days, you would have to replace it. In which case, in this example, I'm talking about keeping a flock of birds on to 80 weeks of age, just because we know that hens are being kept for longer as their egg quality is improving and so on. And so if you assume the birds come in at about 16 weeks and you're going to keep them to 80 weeks, then we have 64 weeks of time where we need to provide enrichments. Then we would have to put down 16 bales 20 times. And therefore, the total cost of providing lucerne hay bales as enrichment in this example would be just over £2,000 for the lifetime of the flock. Now, bearing in mind that the accreditation scheme, in our case, the RSPCA accreditation scheme that all our flocks were signed up to, you need to provide 2 items per 1,000 hens. Then you would either have to provide double this, or you would have to provide bales and something else. So bear in mind that this is the cost of just providing this one particular enrichment, and that you would have to either double it or provide another one. So for example, what about the pecking blocks? Well, the pecking blocks, remember, we had to provide them in 4 pairs in every quarter. So it's not 16 blocks we would have to provide to our laying hens, it's 32 blocks in order to give them the right amount. And Crystallix in Germany advised us that they would probably last about 10 days when we give a pair to 1,000 birds. But in fact, we saw on average that they lasted longer than that. They lasted about 15 days. But there was a variation there as well of about five days. So I think some people replaced them religiously every 10 days. Other people just waited to see if they fell apart or if they lasted a bit longer, and took up to almost 20 days. Now, the cost of the blocks per block, it was £7, and the replacement rate is quicker than the hay bales, and so you would actually need to replace these 30 times in the lifetime of the flock at this rate. And so, and you have to provide more of them. And so the total cost of using pecking blocks in this example would be over £6,700. So it's considerably more expensive than the bales. And then when it came to the pelleted feed, as I said, there's no variation in the provision of pelleted feed because the staff are just providing it according to the timetable we gave them, twice a day, 2 kilos at each time. The feed that we used was pelleted feed from 4 farmers. This was also donated, as were the Crystallix blocks and hay bales. But if you were to buy it from 4 farmers, it cost £8.38 for a 20 kilo bag, or you could order it by the ton. and at that time it was would be 419 pounds per ton. So you have to replace this every day, twice a day. So there's 448 replacements of 2 kilos. And so that would cost you a little over £3,000. Now, because you have to buy feed in bags of 20, I had rounded up to the right number of bags because you can't buy half a bag. So yeah, about £3,000 to provide scattered pelleted feed to the birds. Now the ropes, in contrast, we had expected the ropes to last for about 6 months, so 180 days. They didn't last that long. They got replaced a lot more frequently, about 97 days. But again, it varied by more than a month from flock to flock. Now ropes are really cheap. It's not very much to buy this big reel of rope that can last you a long time. And per 30 centimeter section that we used, it costs you a little over 8 pence. And so on the replacement rate that you see here, to provide 16 ropes as one of your enrichments would cost you less than £7 for the entire lifetime of the flock. And so here's where we come to the interesting point. In our study, although ropes showed very little and virtually no interest to hens, as you saw from one of the earliest graphs, ropes were as interesting as the area that had no enrichment at all, that away area. Although they don't seem to be of interest to hens, they are really cheap, in contrast to these other items that I'm showing you, which are comparatively expensive. So I can imagine that where an accreditation scheme wants you to provide 2 types of destructible enrichments, and ropes are destructible in a way because they fray and fall apart, and they do need replacing, unlike a football or a traffic cone or hanging CDs. Those things are not destructible. Then this is an attractive option to be as one of your items to provide because it is inexpensive. And then if you can provide one of these other types of enrichments, which are more attractive based on the time spent interacting with the enrichment, then that's perhaps a happy medium to strike. Something I should say about ropes, though, is that although we didn't see any indication of interest in the ropes, if you think about how big the ropes are, they're tiny. I'm trying to get my fingers on the screen. They're kind of 30 centimeter lengths that have been looped over in half. So there's only about 15 centimeters showing that are hanging off the alighting rail in the multi-tier system. So by volume, they are minuscule compared to these big hay bales, which are big, easy to find, easy to see, and can take more birds interacting with them than single ropes. So one of the drawbacks, I suppose, of this study might be that we should have provided things of comparable bulk in order to make them easier to compare. But having said that, what the evidence we saw about ropes was that they just aren't very attractive to hens. So to conclude from all of that, all the enrichments apart from rope did encourage interaction with that enrichment. The peck blocks and the bales were attractive at all observation times, but in contrast, the pelleted feed kind of peaked and waned. It was particularly of interest when the feed had just been scattered, but it was of less interest after that in the hour before scattering and the hour after scattering. But even pelleted feed was still of more interest to rope. However, one of the key behaviors we were interested in to see that we were encouraging was foraging behavior, and that was not affected by the type of enrichment provided apart from that drop-off of foraging in the area when birds in the pelleted feed area went to interact with the pelleted feed. The ropes, as I said, are the least useful to hens, but they're also the cheapest. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, they're also the smallest, and so they're perhaps harder to locate. Previous literature recommends that hens are provided with not only destructible enrichments, but also ones that are nutritive. But those things like the pelleted feed, the bales, and the PEC blocks are costly. It might be beneficial in the future to do a full economic analysis over cost versus benefits of these enrichments to see if they really are financially beneficial. We couldn't do that in this study because we were looking at shed quarters, and of course the eggs and mortality are not recorded on a quarter by quarter basis. They're recorded as the entire shed. So we couldn't collect that data appropriately. But you could set up, in theory, a smaller study that uses a research station, or perhaps even a larger study where you have entire flocks that are given one type of enrichment or another, and then you can collect information about mortality, egg production, egg quality, and so on. So I just wanted to acknowledge we are very grateful for the funding that PROFREPA gave us towards this study. The study was also funded by the Scottish Government. We are grateful for the 4 farms who put themselves forward for the study. They each provided 2 flocks, and they were very accommodating in us coming in and installing our enrichments in different scenarios. And I'd like to offer my grateful thanks to the people who provided the enrichments. So Doug Wanstall provided all the lucerne hay bales and transported them from Kent up to Scotland. Scotmin and Crystallix, or Scotmin's the local company and Crystallix is the German company that provided the pecking blocks, also free of charge, delivered them to the farms and so on. And also to 4 farmers who provided all the layer pellets and delivered them accordingly, also free of charge. Without the participation of the farmers or the people that provided the enrichments, the study wouldn't have happened. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was reasonably clear. Sorry I can't join you today, but if you have any questions that Alison minutes and sends to me, I'll be happy to respond, and I hope those get back to you in due course. Thanks again. Bye.